Okay, so I was thinking we've got Sangha Day on Sunday, and I've been thinking a lot about forgiveness, which is, I say, it's a big subject, isn't it? Forgiveness, forgiving ourselves and others. And this, the piece I'm going to read, which basically is where the talk is kind of, the words have come from. I heard this years ago. I think I was organising on one of Sangha Jeevani's retreats. And she read this, and I just loved it, absolutely loved it. And so the words have kind of stemmed from this. People might have heard it before, but even if you have, it's worth hearing again. And I don't know where it comes from either. In the Babemba tribe of South Africa, when a person acts irresponsibly or unjustly, he is placed in the center of the village, alone and unfettered. All work ceases, and every man, woman, and child in the village gathers in a large circle around the accused individual. Then each person in the tribe speaks to the accused one at a time, each recalling the good things the person in the center of the circle has done in his lifetime. Every incident, every experience that can be recalled with any detail and accuracy is recounted. All his positive attributes, good deeds, strengths, and kindnesses are recited carefully and at length. This tribal ceremony often lasts for several days. At the end, the tribal circle is broken, a joyous celebration takes place, and the person is symbolically and literally welcomed back into the tribe. I just love that. I've always loved that. So, let's say where it's come from, I do not know. So I wanted to say a little bit about that, having given it some thought and a bit on forgiveness, and then it won't, might end up the timing slightly different tonight. We have a slightly longer sit in the second half, which is fine. So I kind of broke the talk down. I was the little piece down. So in the Babemba tribe, a collection of people, a community, a Sangha. When a person acts irresponsibly or unjustly, we all do it. There will be times when we act irresponsibly and unjustly. It's probably a bit of a generalization, but probably we do. We just don't think before we act or take on board the consequences of our actions. Acting unjustly in a manner that is not in accordance with what is morally right and fair. He's placed in the center of the village, alone and unfettered. So he's separated, but in a way, he's still very much connected. Because we can be away from our kind of Sangha and our friends, can't we, and still feel really strongly connected. Unfettered, which I thought was quite an interesting word to have in there. I think, and this is only me, suggests this person's kind of accepts that there are consequences to his actions and almost welcomes being made aware of this, knowing he'll have the support of his fellow members in the tribe. But it is interesting, unfettered. We could perhaps have a look at that in the discussion groups. So all work ceases, and every man, woman, and child in the village gather in a large circle around the accused individual. So this is important for everyone. Work ceases, everything comes to a halt. And this is for the sake of everybody, not just for the person they're talking about. So this takes priority. Every person is part of this. Every person witnesses everybody else, listens to everybody else. Everybody is taken into account, whether old or young. And I was thinking, how often do we really feel listened to or taken into account? It's worth thinking about that. I know for myself, being my great age, I sometimes feel you kind of disappear. Then each person in the tribe speaks to the accused one at a time, each recalling the good things the person in the center of the circle has done in his lifetime. Every incident, every experience that can be recalled with any details and accuracy recounted. All his positive deeds, strengths, and kindnesses are recited carefully and at length. So every person there has a voice. Everyone is listened to. Every voice is as important as every other voice. They're all recalling all the good acts this person has done. They're all voicing the positive actions of this person's life. Obviously, as is the way for all of us, there will be negative actions as well as the positive, but they are only voicing the positive. I think it's quite sad in the world we occupy. We're so quick to focus, aren't we, on the negative and not take into account the positive actions, which on the whole will probably far outweigh the negative and the unskillful. But we zone in, don't we? So a person does one little thing and we zone into that, which is sad, isn't it? Because it's a tiny part of kind of what they are. So the tribal ceremony often lasts for several days. Would we be prepared to go to these lengths? Would we? Put our lives aside, our precious lives aside for a few days in order to regain harmony? You know, would we? Worth asking ourselves, isn't it? I do appreciate life isn't as simple as that for most of us probably, but at the end of the tribal circle is broken, a joyous celebration takes place, and the person is symbolically and literally welcomed back into the tribe. And I read this and I thought, yes, the circle is broken, but the circle, the connections remain intact. You know, we're here tonight with each other, but when we walk through the door at the end of the night, we don't lose the connections, do we? We're still very much in each other's thoughts. We don't kind of just, at that gate, it just kind of slices through. We're still in each other's kind of circle. And then there's an obvious feeling of elation throughout the tribe. They will all know on some level these things will happen again. And once again, they'll form their circle, a circle of support and love for the person in the middle. One person, one tribe. I really love that. There's so much in it, isn't there? And it's just, they wouldn't call themselves a Sangha, but it's kind of Sangha operating at its best, isn't it? Trying to restore harmony. And I think I read into it that everybody there has confidence that harmony will be restored. It will happen because everybody's part of the process, aren't they? Whether you're elderly or whether you're a child, everybody's part of that process. So they all have confidence that it will happen, and it does. So I went on to think, as a Sangha, are we more likely to forgive each other? Are we? We have the tools, don't we? We have the tools. We have the Dharma. I kind of think on the whole we are, because we know that life throws up a lot of difficulties for all of us. And sometimes when we're in those difficulties, we can act in a way which kind of upsets or triggers others. So sadly, as we looked at in the forgiveness prayer, it is inevitable that we will hurt each other knowingly or unknowingly. It can be really small things that can still have a really big effect. I mean, I kind of, I see myself in that situation, and it's very unknowingly, because it's often with my partner, not often, occasionally with my partner. And I'm at a loss as to what I've done or said, or, you know, so it's very unknowingly, but, you know, it still hurts, and it leaves it takes its toll on the person, doesn't it? So, and I thought this was an interesting one, so I wrote it down. But do we ever truly forgive? As conditioned human beings, are we even capable of true forgiveness? That's something I'd like us to look at in the groups. Not just the provisional forgiveness, where we apologize, because that's kind of quite easy to do, isn't it? For all sorts of reasons, to keep the peace or to just stop it in its tracks or whatever. So we've apologized, but are we still kind of quietly seething? But, you know, true forgiveness with no residue of blame or resentment left, real pure forgiveness. Are we capable of that? I mean, I don't know, I'm just asking. So in Buddhism, forgiveness is not presented as a moral commandment. Instead, it is a way to end suffering. It is a way to bring dignity and harmony to our lives. So forgiveness is a crucial step to having peace of mind. And it can be very damaging to be carrying these negative feelings around. and some being held for many years. You know, these things just go on and on. Negative feelings and actions leave their mark. They kind of leave a bruise, you know. Without forgiveness, we are completely chained to the past, still entangled by events maybe way back in our lives, caught in the hurt and pain of the past, and still giving it a lot of energy and letting ourselves be affected by it. When I first met my husband, this is donkeys years ago, we went to see his family for the first time. And I always remember part of his family lived in one house and the rest lived next door. And I said, oh, are we going to see whoever they were and whatever? Oh, no, he said, they don't speak. I said, oh, that must be really different. Yeah, they don't speak. They haven't spoken for years. Literally for years, they hadn't spoken. So his mum and dad were in one house, his aunt was downstairs, and his aunt and uncle were next door. And the two houses hadn't spoken for like, I said, oh God, I said, what happened? It must have been something huge, you know, because this has gone on for like 20 years or something. And nobody knew, nobody could remember. I said, well, what happened? I don't know what happened. We just don't speak anymore. I said, oh, okay. And they didn't. I think they eventually came around, but they'd been living like that for years, you know. I mean, and nobody knew what it was. Nobody could remember. Anyway, that's a long time ago. So the other thing, the reason I was thinking a lot about forgiveness is I've been on retreat recently with somebody I knew from way back when I first started around the movement. And I found her hugely challenging. I'm sure she found me hugely challenging as well. And so when I knew she was going to be on this retreat, I must be honest, I was like, so I was taken straight back. I haven't been around her for years, but, you know, it was painful times. And I was taken back to like 15, 20 years ago, where we seemed to spend our whole time just crashing into each other. And up to this retreat, I was still harboring, I must be honest, some resentments. I wouldn't say they were kind of on the surface about things that were said and a lot of inappropriateness. And I only really noticed those thoughts were still there to some degree when I considered being on retreat with her. And then I was thinking about that, and I was thinking, God, those thoughts are still there, sitting in my whatever, sitting in here. And they've come to the surface now because I'm about to spend a week with her. But I suppose I got so used to having those levels of, I don't know, resentment, blame, whatever. I wasn't even particularly aware of them, which is quite, I've given that a lot of thought, because it can't be good, can it, to have all that negativity kind of sitting in your system. But I hadn't kind of registered it until I thought of spending this week around her. And we got there, and a few days in, I thought, this is fine, actually, because we both, to some degree, she's been ordained since, and we just moved on, you know. But the things had still been said, and we hadn't had a conversation about the past. But these feelings had just kind of, I suppose, dissipated over the years, you know. And we did chat a bit, and I could see that a point of resolve had been reached. And I kind of learned this over the years, that if you are having difficulties with somebody, the point of resolve doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be bosom buddies. I mean, it would be nice if that was always the case, but I shouldn't really say this, but I'd kind of be surprised if we were ever bosom buddies. But anyway, but we'd reached a good point with each other, you know, so that was kind of our point of resolve. And I do know that, because she's in Cardiff, where I kind of grew up around the movement. And I do know that if we were seeing each other more regularly, there'd need to be a deeper conversation. So, but given the circumstances, we were kind of in an okay place with each other. Well, a good place with each other. It's nice being in the shrine room. I really recognized that. It was just nice to be around her in those ways, you know. But then I thought, when I got home, I thought, well, it's easy to get into those positive places. I've been on retreat, you know, and it was good experience, and it's easy to be. So when I got home, I wrote to her and apologized for any hurt I had caused her in any way. And I thought, well, why am I still hanging on to those feelings? And I thought, it's just ego. I kind of wanted to preserve my idea that I was right. I was right. like protecting my deluded sense of self. Of course I'm right. So forgiveness is a way to move on. Have I any residue left from the years of hurt? Yeah, probably. Well, not probably. Yes, I do. But my apology was real. It works in layers, doesn't it? And my apology to her was real. And I definitely saw her as another human being, just navigating her way through the intricacies of a human life. I suppose for me, it's also about choosing your battle. I could get into an awkward place with her, but there really is enough. It's not like that's the last thing I've got to deal with and then I'm going to be enlightened. I have got enough stuff to be doing. I don't need to be getting caught up in stuff, And in saying that, I do absolutely appreciate there's very different levels of hurt and harm. This was just two people who could never find a way with each other. There's obviously different levels of this. So forgiveness is a real process. I do feel I've cleared a few layers, but there undoubtedly will be more. It can be very difficult to get out of our own way enough to even reach the point where you can begin the forgiving process. Forgiveness can be tough. And as I've already said, there's a vast difference between two human beings not seeing eye to eye and someone who's been really hurt or damaged. And I was also reading this as well, which I thought was interesting. Do we ever on some level consciously decide not to forgive? As in that not forgiving place, maybe we feel that we've got the upper hand, the controlling hand. We've managed to kid ourselves that we are right. And maybe we didn't play the biggest part in some disagreement as we saw it, but were we part of the conditions that brought about the discord? And I think that's a good one to look at. Do we ever almost decide not to forgive? Because it's kind of and also I think it takes an effort to forgive, doesn't it? And sometimes it's just easy to sit back in somewhere and not make the effort. Sangha Jivani will often have that conversation with me, are you really making enough effort there to move on? Or is it easy just to sit back in something? So, yeah, it's worth thinking about. So change takes effort, doesn't it? And sometimes it's just easy just to sit back and kid ourselves that, we've done all we can do, but have we? And then I was thinking that sadly, we often hear on the news about a young person, being murdered. And then sometime later, the family is saying how it's forgiven the murderer. And the family will often talk about those feelings of anger towards the killer, and they feel consumed by those feelings, which is obviously deeply affecting their lives. So they talk about how they saw the only way forward was to forgive and free themselves from the negativity of anger. Is that complete and true forgiveness? I don't know. I don't know whether that is. I'm not about to say something amazing. I just don't know whether that is true forgiveness. If you've reached that point, you are absolutely consumed by those feelings of negativity and hatred. But I don't know if it's true forgiveness. I was reading about the woman, this goes back to, is it 2005 when the bombings were in London? And she was a vicar and her 24-year-old daughter was killed in those bombings. And after a period, she felt she could no longer preach. So she actually, she resigned because she didn't feel she could be delivering the, preaching when she just absolutely couldn't find a way of forgiving for the murder of her daughter. And most of us, hopefully, will never experience that kind of level of suffering. So I don't think we can know what our reaction might be. We might have all sorts of ideas, I'd do this, but we don't know, do we? We don't know. So forgiveness is fundamentally for our own sake, for our own mental health. It is a way to let go of the pain we carry. The story of the two ex-prisoners of war illustrates this point clearly. So two ex-prisoners met after many years, and the first one asked the second, "Have you forgiven your captors yet?" The second man answers, "No, never." "Well, then," the first man replies, "they still have you in prison." Because he was still so caught up in it, and it was having such an effect on his life. He was still in the same place without the bars, So for most people, the work of forgiveness is a tender process. Practicing forgiveness We may go through stages of grief, rage, sorrow, fear, and confusion. As we let ourselves feel the pain we still carry. But forgiveness can come as a real relief, even the layers of forgiveness, you know, a lifting of that burden on some level, a kind of release of the energy we've put into that resentment or hurt over years, like my ex-husband's family feud. So I'm laughing about it, but it's quite sad, isn't it, really? So apology and confession are really humbling practices, because we don't often want to stand down or even try and forget the hurt that somebody's caused. And I was thinking, with that order member on retreat recently, I literally felt I had to drag myself out of the way to move things on. I did. I almost saying, well, I did. I said to myself out loud, come on, you know this could be different. Just stop doing what you're doing and move it on, you know. I failed to take on board the hurt I had caused, because for a long time I thought, well, I'm sure I've obviously have been part of the hurt, but she's been more part of the hurt. You know, so it's about letting go those fixed views where we decide we are right. Of course I'm right. I'm Ajayasraddha. Of course I'm right. So I think it's worth considering whether we really appreciate the difference between genuine forgiveness and some sort of resentful backing down, where we're kind of having a mutter and perhaps saying sorry, but we're sorry, you know that. What about if you want to offer the hand of forgiveness, but the other person isn't ready to even hear your words? Where do you go with that? That's a difficult one, isn't it? If you've reached a point where you want to have that conversation, but the other person just isn't ready. So maybe if we accept that this is a position at the moment, knowing that situations change, in accepting and putting some space around our thoughts, maybe we can find a more creative way, a way of accepting the unresolved situation. There wouldn't be much else we could do, would there? If one person wants to have the conversation and the other one's saying, no, I'm not ready for it, we just have to find a way of accepting it, you know. And as I said before, resolve doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be strolling off into the sunset together. It could just be that you found a way of being able to be around each other, being accepting of each other. So for me, on the whole, I believe, at least within the Sangha, my experience on the whole tells me that I would be given a chance to talk things through, at least to be heard and taken into account. Doesn't necessarily mean we'll resolve anything, but I would hope that I kind of would be heard, you know. I know this isn't always the case. We all need a different time scale to get to a point when we are ready to talk and attempt to clear the air, so to speak. And as I said, it can be hard if one person is at this point and the other is not. And how do we work with that, accept that situation? So I'm nearly there, folks. So what about forgiving ourselves? I think this is a hugely difficult area, actually, forgiving ourselves. What are we doing when we hang on to the negative views about ourselves? Is it just a habit we've got into? I've certainly seen it's a habit I've got into, being kind of negative. Not helpful at all for me or anybody around me. So if we look honestly at our lives, we can see the sorrow and pain that has led to our own unskillfulness. By seeing this, we can begin to forgive ourselves. And we're just all human beings, sometimes experiencing a degree of harmony, and sometimes all our stuff colliding full force into someone else's stuff with all the resultant consequences. And it's painful, isn't it? It's very painful when that happens. But it's not, even though we're feeling the pain, it's often quite difficult just to go up to the person and have the conversation, because we're just caught up where we're caught up, you know. So I think the most helpful responses in all of this is to make sure we are kind towards ourselves. It's so easy to say that, isn't it? I'm the last one that should be saying that, but it is easy to say. Okay, we make mistakes, we lose our temper, lose any useful sense of anybody else. And that's why we need Sangha, others that we trust, who will point things out to us with our best interests at heart. Obviously, we have to be careful and considered with this. So building Sangha, building connections, this is what it's all about. Yes. So forgiveness, big subject.